The world in turmoil, making sense of the current and future conflicts. We are going to start with a conflict that is not very recent. We are going to start with a conflict that took place in the 5th century before current era, the so-called Peloponnesian War. And those of you who have been studying international relations, my home discipline, are probably familiar with that conflict to some extent. This was a war that broke out in 431st year before current era between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies, the so-called Peloponnesian War. And there are different reasons why this war is important for us. Perhaps one of the most important one is that people like me, scholars, students of international relations, have been somehow obsessed with this conflict, thinking about it, thinking about the implications, thinking about the patterns and the relevance to today. The single reason why this conflict has become very popular in modern times in terms of studying wars and conflicts is Thucydides, Greek historian, general, who told the story of the war in great detail. And if I can make recommendations for books, I would encourage you to get this one if you're interested in history, in wars. It's a great story, and particularly this edition with the cover that looks like that, because it is annotated on the margins, so it will guide you through the text as you read it. What Thucydides did is he not only took account of this conflict. He told us a detailed story of that conflict, how it happened, who was involved, but he also theorized about the reasons why this conflict broke out in the first place. And perhaps this is the main reason why that conflict is or has become interesting for scholars of international relations throughout 20th and 21st century. And here is how he defined the causes of that war. The final point was reached when Athenian strength attained a peak plain for all to see, and the Athenians began to encroach upon Sparta's allies. It was at this point that Sparta felt its position was no longer tolerable and decided by starting this present war to employ all energies in attacking and, if possible, destroying the power of Athens. And now comes the most famous one-liner associated with that book. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Right? Regardless of how accurate it is, this was how Thucydides saw the origins of that war. And essentially what he said was we had two powers. One was a status quo power. The other one was, in a way, revisionist power, a power that was growing. And clash between them seemed inevitable, right? And certainly accounted for why the war broke out. What does it mean for us in the 21st century? Well, here is another book that you may be familiar with if you have been studying international relations. Destined for War. Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap by Graham Allison, a famous American political scientist. Destined for war. Is the world destined for war? Is America and China destined for war? Thucydides' Trap. What is it? It is a pattern. It is a pattern that a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. Graham Allison returned to this Peloponnesian War, returned to Thucydides and thought, okay, let's look throughout history. Have we seen that pattern repeating itself? And he did research and he found that yes, there is something that he calls Thucydides' Trap, where wars have been occurring, breaking out as a result of shifting power balances, shifting distribution of power between countries, smaller and larger. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the resulting structural stress makes a violent clash the rule, not the exception. Today, it has set the world's two biggest powers on a path to a cataclysm nobody wants, but which they may prove unable to avoid. The idea here is that it is very difficult, if possible at all, for powers to prevent conflicts, even if the parties involved don't want it, don't think it would be a good idea, and think that they are doing things to prevent it, right? So that's the link between what we have today and this first big conflict that was described to such an extent. And the first conclusions were drawn that then fed my own discipline of international relations when we try to understand what and why is happening in the world in terms of war and peace. What is the power distribution today? Well, in international relations, we like to categorize powers, use language to describe different kinds of powers. So one way to describe the distribution of power today is to talk about status quo powers and revisionist powers. And of course, a status quo power since the end of the Second World War is the United States and its allies, primarily in Europe, but also in parts of Asia. And then we have revisionist powers, powers that are determined to challenge the status quo. They do not like the world order that has emerged since the end of the Cold War. And it's primarily China with the greatest capacity to challenge that world order, but of course it, as it happens, work in a semi-alliance with Russia, and they are supported by Iran and perhaps more recently North Korea. That is the kind of distribution of power today, if we look at it for the purposes of what we want to talk about today. That is the prospect of different regional conflicts turning into a larger war, larger confrontation. That brings me to hotbeds of instability. What are the key hotbeds of instability? What are the key potential sources of a larger conflict going beyond any of those particular regions? The first one is Israel-Hamas war. Right? The war has been happening, of course, for decades with periods of peace in between, very fragile peace. There has been a lot of bloodshed. Most recently, of course, the war broke out on a full scale following the Hamas terrorist attacks on October the 7th. What matters to us is not so much the conflict itself. You can read about it as much as you like. What matters for us is a bigger picture. What matters for us is the fact that Iran is in a way implicitly or explicitly supporting the war because it is convenient for Iran. It is also convenient for Russia in ways that we will talk about. War in Ukraine, of course, perpetrated by Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022 for the second time. This time it was a full-scale invasion. The war is supported by Iran, and it is convenient for China in ways that we will also talk about. Potential war in South China Sea and Taiwan, likely supported by Russia. Most certainly, if China makes a move on Taiwan, Russia will be very unlikely to oppose that conflict. This is the only conflict of those three that has not yet happened, it may happen if the United States and China fall into Thucydides' trap, and this war is likely to be most consequential for international relations. Israel-Hamas war. It is unlikely to escalate to a wider regional or global conflict. At this point, it is unlikely that it will significantly escalate. It's not impossible, but the signs are that it is not very likely. Israeli response to October 7th strengthened Iran in the Muslim world. That is the issue here. That is one of the issues here, right? It may not escalate, but it already has, and it will have consequences to the global distribution of power and the kind of regional and global geopolitics. And the position of Iran has been strengthened as a result of that war, especially in the Muslim world. Equally importantly, or perhaps even more importantly to some extent, or in some respects, the war between Israel and Hamas has diverted American attention away from Ukraine, and created opportunities for both Russia and China. They can position themselves as responsible stakeholders. Russia received Hamas delegation. Russia aims to position itself as a country that is a responsible stakeholder here, sending a signal to the Muslim world that it is potentially on their side. China is also kind of looking, and it works to China's favor that this war will continue to progress. Because, of course, what does this war do? It diverts American attention and it diverts American resources, right? It is yet another challenge that planners in Pentagon and the White House have to think about, have to plan for, have to commit, allocate budget for. And here is a quote from a Financial Times article that underscores some of those points that I made. The Islamic Republic has seized the moment to narrow the gap within Arab and regional leaders, whose pro-Palestinian positions have shifted closer to Iran's since the war began. This war has been a victory in white gloves for Iran, said one analyst in Tehran. Another said Iran has so far successfully stayed away from any direct involvement in the war and improved its relations with Arab states. Iran is a regional, in a way, winner of that conflict because it has strengthened its regional position, and it is continuously strengthening its position as an ally of Russia against its war in Ukraine. Iran, you probably will notice, has been famously delivering drones and other equipment to Russia, which Russia has been short on. So that is all very convenient. Moving on to the war in Ukraine. As we mentioned, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, and I argue it is the most, well, maybe not right now, but the weeks of the invasion were the most important and most dangerous moment in international relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the war itself is the most significant conflict since the Second World War. The United States, NATO, and the West took Russian nuclear deterrence seriously. At the time of this war breaking out in February last year, there was a lot of concern. What would it mean for broader international relations? And Putin was kind of explicit making his nuclear threats. He was openly talking about nuclear weapons. He did try to tone it all down, but then if you watched Russian state media and other officials, they were less constrained They were more openly challenging what we call in international relations nuclear taboo. This idea that nuclear weapons should not be used in international relations since the end of the Second World War. What did it mean? It meant that the West was only gradually increasing military aid for Ukraine throughout 2022 and the beginning of 2023. The West was successfully deterred from getting more involved in helping Ukraine to fight the Russian aggression. Ukraine planned for a counteroffensive to take place in spring and summer of this year, but it is fair to say at this point that this counteroffensive failed to achieve its objective. The Western support for Ukraine is wavering. At this point, this war is also unlikely to escalate to a wider or perhaps even nuclear conflict. And here is a broader picture here. From the perspective of different actors involved, the United States has been, is, and kind of remains the biggest supporter of Ukraine, but the support for Ukraine is strongly opposed internally within the United States, especially by what we call MAGA Republicans, those Republicans who are supporting Donald Trump. The United States is also concerned with this notion of overstretching, right? Spreading its resources too thin. And that brings us back to the question of the impact of the war between Israel and Hamas, right? And Chinese provocations and signals towards Taiwan. This also, as a side point, I will note, highlights the importance of studying domestic politics for the purpose of understanding international relations. It's not sufficient just to be happy with looking at the world through the lens of what we call structural theories of international relations that look at states in a way of a kind of forest view, neo-realism, neoliberalism in particular, also constructivism. I would argue it is important to look at domestic sources of foreign policy, especially in liberal democracies, in democratic states, because they significantly affect foreign policy outcomes and, as a result, the international relations dynamics as such. The transformation of the Republican Party in the United States over the last few decades is astonishing. It's amazing. If we had people like John McCain, if we had people like Ronald Reagan today, right, they would have a completely different vision of how the United States should behave compared to the leaders of the Republican Party today. They would be, those leaders who are no longer here, they would be much more critical of Russia, much more committed perhaps to helping Ukraine and defeating Russia, as opposed to people like Donald Trump, who are not, right? Shall we put it this way? Europe has been surprisingly united in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In spite the fact that it is a combination of different countries with different interests, it has been able to adopt sanctions, and those sanctions had to be adopted unanimously. The problem is the relative weak of Europe, right? Europe has not been able, even if it wanted to provide enough weapons of enough quality to Ukraine, for Ukraine to sustain its defense, not to mention to equip it for an effective counteroffensive without the United States, right? So the United States remain a key actor. Europe has been united, but it's relatively weak. Of course, we have countries like Hungary and now Slovakia that somehow distort this image of united Europe, but that has been, the EU has been able to work through those differences. Putin and Russia, they have been badly damaged by the conflict, but not defeated. Russia turned into a wartime economy. It now puts all of its efforts into extending the war for as long as possible. It has, in a way, adapted to a wide range of sanctions that were imposed on Russia, and those sanctions, by the way, are unprecedented, and they really were severe, but Russia has been able to overcome, in a way, some of those sanctions in different ways with the support of countries like China, but also Central Asian countries. Putin, even if he wanted to withdraw from Ukraine at this point, he can't, because his own personal power, his own personal authority is at stake. He would very likely not survive as a president, possibly as a person who is alive, an attempt to withdraw from Ukraine with the overall perception that Russia lost. So he plays for time. He believes that the time is on his side. China, I argue, is the biggest winner of the war in Ukraine. President Xi implicitly supports Putin against the United States and NATO, even if it officially positions itself, even if China officially positions itself as a responsible mediator and stakeholder who wants nothing more than peace. But by supporting Russia, of course, China makes Russia even more dependent on Russia. China makes Russia even more dependent on exporting its natural resources to China. And the value of the kind of Russia as a partner decreases by the month from the Chinese perspective. Of course, a semi-alliance with Russia is convenient for China because it also serves its own domestic political purposes. Neither two of those countries are liberal democracies, both are dictatorships, right? So it is convenient for them to work together because they may feel equally threatened, and they do. Dictatorships tend to be paranoid about their grip on power and how much power they have and how stable the rule of the dictators is. North Korea is also, I would argue, a big winner of the war. Russia, I would say, humiliated itself recently, having to reach out to North Korea and establish closer relations with North Korea because it was running out of ammunition. So North Korea is now arming, together with Iran, arming Russia, filling those gaps in ammunition shortages. And again, that works to the advantage of North Korea because some of the attention is diverted again away from North Korea's nuclear program. So this is the kind of, again, big picture overview of what the war in Ukraine means for international relations. Finally, China and Taiwan. That's the third hotspot that we can and we have to talk about here. Taiwan, a bit of a background, Taiwan has been governed independently of China since 1949, but Beijing views the island as part of its territory. Beijing has vowed to eventually unify Taiwan with the mainland using force if necessary. In 1979, the United States established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. At the same time, it severed its diplomatic ties and abrogated its mutual defense treaty with the Republic of China, that is Taiwan. But the United States maintains a robust unofficial relationship with the island and continues to sell defense equipment to its military. In August 2022, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taipei. Beijing strongly condemned the visit and in response planned military exercises that effectively surrounded the island. So in a nutshell, that is again a big picture overview of what this potential conflict is about. The main thing is this: whilst China and Chinese people, Chinese political class, Chinese Communist Party have all been feeling strongly about Taiwan during the Cold War, after the Cold War, there was not much that China could effectively do about its status. The main thing is that this has changed. Recently, this has changed, especially under Xi Jinping, who has been turning China away from this kind of economic, yet in a way kind of peaceful power towards this more assertive foreign policy, military power. So that, of course, has an impact on the rhetoric and the ambitions of Chinese leader when it comes to the South China Sea, and especially when it comes to Taiwan. Very recently, Joe Biden reaffirmed American commitment to defend Taiwan. So that is, out of all those three hotbeds that we talk about today, all those three problems and conflicts, this may be the one that will be most consequential and is most serious in different ways. And that brings us again back to Thucydides. How to think about that conflict, how to think about that potential clash between the United States and China, but also the Chinese relationship to Taiwan. Here is a quote from the famous dialogue. Again, if you are familiar with international relations as a discipline, you will be familiar with the so-called Melian dialogue. Athenian delegation, right? Athens as a city-state, it had a lot of allies, but there was this island, Melos, which remained neutral, and Athens didn't like it very much. So it sent its delegation to talk some sense to Melos, to join its alliance against Sparta. And here are the arguments that they used. Here's the first quote. "The right, as the world goes, is only in question between equal in power. While the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." And the second one. "As far as right goes, one has as much of it as the other. And if any maintain their independence, it is because they are strong. And that if we do not molest them, it is because we are afraid." How to translate it into the dynamics between China and Taiwan today? Well, this quote, this interpretation of how the world works feeds into a theoretical paradigm in my discipline of international relations that we call a realist paradigm. And in this paradigm, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So if we adopt that paradigm, from that perspective, China is doing towards Taiwan what it feels it must, what is in its national interest, and Taiwan has no agency in that confrontation. Taiwan has no say. This also engages with the question of morals. What is moral in international relations? What is ethical? Well, all states have basis. All states are entitled to claim that what they do is moral. And all states do. The worst dictatorships will try to adopt nowadays some kind of language of morality and right. But in the end, what matters is power, right? If a country doesn't attack another country, it is because it is afraid. not because it thinks it's immoral. Here is another perspective. A controversial American political scientist, John Mearsheimer, he loves to comment on current conflicts and he loves to comment on future conflicts. And he also has a theory about the rise of China. He asked in one of his publications, can China rise peacefully? Can the United States accommodate, in a way, the rise of China? Can the two countries work together peacefully? He says no. Here's what he says. Offensive realism, that is his paradigm that he contributed to the discipline of international relations, offers important insights into China's rise. My argument in a nutshell is that if China continues to grow economically, it will attempt to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The United States, however, will go to enormous lengths to prevent China from achieving regional hegemony. Most of Beijing's neighbors, including India, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Russia, and Vietnam, will join with the United States to contain Chinese power. The result will be an intense security competition with considerable potential for war. In short, China's rise is unlikely to be tranquil. So that's one perspective on this rise of China. So from Mearsheimer's perspective, the United States and China are unlikely to avoid what Graham Allison calls Thucydides' trap. The rise of one power and the anxiety it causes in another power's calculations and strategic thinking will inevitably at some point lead to clash. Now we move to Henry Kissinger. He's a controversial figure. He was a controversial figure, but he also thought about the question of World War III and how to avoid it. And he sat down with the reporters from The Economist, and he had a long conversation with them about how to avoid World War III. So here is what he has to say about China. He would start with lowering the temperature and then gradually build confidence and a working relationship, rather than listing all the grievances the American president would say to his Chinese counterpart, Mr. President, the two greatest dangers to peace right now are us two, in the sense that we have the capacity to destroy humanity. China and America, without formally announcing anything, would aim to practice restraint. Kissinger famously has been a big fan of bilateral diplomacy between states, with a small group of people on one side meeting with a small group of people on the other side and talking things through on a personal level. That's how he has been working when he was working in the Nixon administration in the United States. That's the way he opened the United States to China for the first time since the Communist Revolution. He's not a big believer in international organizations, international law, global governance, and all those fancy, progressive, liberal inventions. He believes in the old-fashioned diplomacy and the balance of power. So he would want to see the leaders of both countries talk to each other like they did recently in San Francisco and try to lower the temperature, even if the issues at stake cannot be resolved at this time, because the objective interests are fundamentally different. Regarding Russia, to establish a lasting peace in Europe requires the West to take two leaps of imagination. The first is for Ukraine to join NATO as a means of restraining it as well as protecting it. The second is for Europe to engineer a rapprochement with Russia as a way to create a stable eastern border. Kissinger famously changed his mind. Forever, he had been against Ukraine joining NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a defensive alliance that was created in 1949 by the United States and its allies to protect them against the potential Soviet invasion. It served its purpose during the Cold War. After the Cold War, it didn't disappear. It continued to exist. It reconceptualized its purpose, and it continued to admit new members. Personally, I don't like to talk about NATO expansion. I don't like the language of NATO expansion, and perhaps it has to do with my own origin. I'm from Poland originally. From my perspective, NATO never expanded to Poland. From my perspective, Poland was fighting hard to convince American and European policymakers to allow Poland to join NATO. And countries in Central and Eastern Europe, for the most part, feel that way. They don't feel that NATO expanded to those countries. They feel that they had to fight very, very hard against resistance to allow those countries to eventually join NATO and enjoy the defense assurances that NATO guarantees against the potential Russian threat. So Kissinger was against Ukraine joining NATO because he thought it would be a provocation towards Russia. Ukraine should remain a buffer state between the West and Russia. And that was in line with Kissinger's kind of general thinking. But since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, he changed his mind. He said that this policy failed, and Ukraine becoming a kind of big European military power, relatively speaking, will have to be restrained, kind of civilized in a way, but also protected against potential kind of future Russian invasions once some kind of peace is achieved following the current conflict. But he also says, and that's something that is not, again, surprising to him, Europe will be unable to pretend that Russia doesn't exist. Europe will have to engage with Russia one way or another. The United States will have to engage with Russia one way or another in the future. But that time is far away from today's perspective. Final reflections. The United States, China, and Russia all express understanding that World War III would be too destructive because of nuclear weapons. All three powers expressly state that World War III would be impossible to win, and that they all are careful to avoid that language, at least officially. They all seem to understand and acknowledge the dangers stemming from the possession of nuclear weapons. Interestingly, China implicitly scolded Putin in early stages of the war for his nuclear threats. That was interesting and perhaps a little bit unexpected, but Xi Jinping expressly stated that nuclear weapons should not be used and that rhetoric should not be used about nuclear weapons, and Putin listened. He kind of dropped that idea of trying to blackmail and threaten Western countries with nuclear weapons. That would, we have to say, that would be a catastrophe for China. Any use of nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe for China because China very much relies on its connection to global markets, Western markets, global markets. It would be a catastrophe. The military buildup of China, including American and Chinese inflexibility on Taiwan, constitute the historical and present threat. That remains, that has been for decades, and especially now it remains a major problem and a potential threat of escalation. With regards to Ukraine, its best bet may be to cede Russia-occupied territory in exchange for NATO membership. Recently, there was a proposal that emerged by a former NATO Secretary General who said that it may be a good idea for Ukraine to actually join NATO relatively soon, but without territories that are occupied by Russia. because Ukraine is unlikely to recover those territories, and if it has an ambition to join NATO, it should forget about those territories for the time being. What would happen is NATO would extend its Article 5 guarantees. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is an article that stipulates that an aggression against one member state is an aggression against all member states. So NATO would extend its security guarantees to Ukraine, Russia's worst nightmare, but without those territories that are occupied currently by Russia. At the same time, Ukraine on its own would be free to try and mount counterattacks and try to recover those stolen territories, but without NATO explicit and implicit approval or support. So that is one possibility, right? The final thing I will say is the role of artificial intelligence, something that we haven't talked about, but something that will increasingly have to be paid attention to. And in fact, the recent meeting in San Francisco between Biden and Xi Jinping was also in important respects covering this issue of artificial intelligence. And this is going to be a challenge in arms control, right? There is this potential danger in the future that weapons will be controlled by artificial intelligence without human involvement. And that was one issue that they talked about at that summit recently. And they reassured one another, they promised one another that in the end, humans would be involved in any decisions involving the launch of weapons against one another. So that is, those are the challenges to come. Those are the challenges to come. But I will stop here, and thank you for listening.